The box wasn't heavy. That was the first thing I noticed. 3 years of my mother's life reduced to a cardboard box that I could lift with one hand. The funeral home called it a personal effects collection. A white box with her name written in marker across the side, Sylvia Ann Mercer. Like she was a package to be picked up at the post office. I drove home in silence. My brother had offered to come with me, but honestly, I didn't want to deal with his wife hovering around, asking if Mom had mentioned any jewelry in her final days. So I went alone, the box in the passenger seat, her name facing me the whole drive. I should back up. My name is Tessa. I'm 32, and until 4 months ago, I was working as a traveling physical therapist, contract work, 12-week assignments, moving from one hospital to the next. Indiana, then New Mexico, then up to Vermont. The pay was good and I was good at the work, but it was lonely in a way that's hard to explain to people who've never lived out of a suitcase. You make friends fast and lose them faster. You learn to be comfortable eating alone. I took the assignment in Vermont because it paid well and I needed the distance. Mom had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's 2 years before that, and watching her decline from far away was its own kind of grief. But every time I tried to come home, something would pull me back. A contract extension, a patient who needed continuity of care. Excuses, if I'm honest. I was scared to watch her get worse up close. My brother, he's 4 years older than me, married with 2 kids in a suburb outside Columbus, had the opposite problem. He was physically close, but emotionally somewhere else entirely. His wife had strong opinions about how caregiving should be handled, which is a polite way of saying she didn't want to do any of it. They hired a home health aide and called it love. Mom never complained. That was the thing about her. She grew up in a family where you didn't ask for help. You made do. You found a way. She'd raised the 2 of us mostly alone after our dad died when I was 9, working double shifts at a dry cleaning shop she eventually bought from the owner when he retired. She ran that place for 21 years, knew every customer by name, knew which ones were going through divorces because of how they acted when they came to pick up clothes. She had a gift for reading people that I've spent my whole adult life trying to inherit. When her hands started shaking, she sold the shop. When she could no longer drive, she sold the car. When I got the call in October that she'd had a fall and been taken to the hospital, I packed my car in 4 hours and drove straight through the night from Burlington. She was okay, a hairline fracture in her wrist, nothing worse, but I knew I wasn't going back to Vermont. I called the agency, told them I needed out of my contract. They weren't happy. I didn't care. Some things are more important than the money. I moved back into my childhood bedroom, which Mom had converted into a sewing room, so I slept on a cot between a dress form and a shelf of thread. I cooked her meals and drove her to appointments and learned to administer her medications on a schedule that took me 2 weeks to stop getting wrong. My brother called every Sunday. That was his contribution. Mom died in February. Quietly, in her own bed, the way she'd wanted. I was holding her hand. My brother arrived 3 hours later. The grief is a whole other story. What matters here is what came after. The will reading was scheduled for a Thursday 2 weeks after the funeral. My brother and his wife drove in the night before and stayed at a hotel downtown, which I thought was odd given that Mom's house, my house, the place I'd been living for 4 months, had 2 empty bedrooms. But his wife preferred hotels. There was a lot his wife preferred. I wore the same black dress I'd worn to the funeral. My brother wore a blazer. His wife wore a blazer too, and carried a leather notebook, which I noticed immediately and didn't comment on. The attorney was a small, precise man who'd handled my mother's affairs for over a decade. He had reading glasses that he kept taking off and putting back on. The office smelled like old paper and coffee. He read the will in the way those things get read, steadily, without drama, in a voice that clearly had delivered both good news and devastating news enough times to have learned that neither warranted any particular performance. Mom had divided her assets into 2 parts. To my brother, she left the house, The childhood home I'd been living in for 4 months. The place I'd scrubbed and organized and cleaned out and grieved inside of. His name on the deed, effective immediately. His wife wrote something in the notebook. To me, she left the dry cleaning shop. I almost laughed, not from bitterness, or not only from bitterness, but because it was so unexpected that my brain couldn't process it as real information. The dry cleaning shop she'd sold 7 years ago, except apparently she'd bought it back. 3 years before she died, she quietly repurchased it from the couple she'd sold it to when they decided to relocate out of state. I hadn't known. My brother hadn't known. He looked at me across the conference table like I'd somehow arranged this. The building was mine. The business license. The equipment, everything. It was also apparently in need of significant work. The attorney described it diplomatically as requiring some investment to return to operational status. The couple who'd run it had done okay for a few years and then less than okay, and then they'd closed it down 18 months before they sold it back to Mom. She'd bought a closed shop. She'd bought it anyway. My brother found his voice in the parking lot. She left you a broken-down laundromat, he said, not even trying to soften it. And I got an actual house. I think she knew what she was doing. His wife nodded. She'd stopped writing in the notebook by this point. She always worried about you, he continued, moving around, no stability, no real plan. She probably thought the house would be too much responsibility for you. I looked at him. I'd held our mother's hand while she died. I'd slept on a cot in her sewing room for 4 months. I'd learned her medication schedule down to the milligram. The shot meant everything to her, I said, more than the house did. He shrugged. The shrug was worse than anything he'd said. They left for Columbus the next morning. I stood in the driveway of a house that was no longer mine and watched until their car disappeared around the corner. I had 30 days to vacate. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters for what comes next. I didn't go to the shop expecting to find anything. I went because I had nowhere else to go that night, and I had a key, and the shop was technically mine, and I needed to be somewhere that felt like it had a future in it instead of just a past. It was a Tuesday evening in late February, cold enough that my breath showed when I stepped out of my car. The sign above the door still said the name of the couple who'd run it last, though the letters were faded, and one of them had come partially unglued. The windows were dark. A flyer someone had taped to the glass had weather-bleached to near illegibility. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. It smelled like industrial solvent and something else underneath it, something that reminded me, suddenly and completely, of being 8 years old and waiting for Mom after school, doing homework on the folding table in the back while the machines ran. It's strange how a smell can reach back through 20 years and pull something up from underneath everything. I walked through the front area, past the counter, past the rows of hanging bags and the old ticketing system Mom had never replaced because she'd said it worked fine, through the door into the back room where the equipment lived. Everything coated in a thin layer of dust. One of the pressing machines had been partially disassembled and not reassembled, which would need to be dealt with. The solvent tank needed inspection. The ventilation system made a sound when I turned it on briefly that suggested problems. I made mental notes. I was good at mental notes. 3 years of contract work means you learn how to assess a new environment fast. Then I noticed the floor. In the far back corner of the utility room, behind a metal shelving unit that had been pushed slightly away from the wall, there was a hatch. Just a wooden panel set flush into the concrete floor, with an inset ring handle. I'd never noticed it as a kid, or maybe I had and filed it away as something adults had reasons for that I didn't need to understand. I moved the shelf. The hatch lifted easily. Below was a short set of wooden stairs leading down into a basement I genuinely had not known existed. My heart did something complicated. I went down. The basement was maybe 15 by 20 feet, with a low ceiling that I had to duck slightly to navigate. shelving along two of the walls, a bare bulb on a pole chain. The smell down there was cedar and paper and something faintly metallic. On the shelves, boxes, labeled in my mother's handwriting, tax records going back to when she'd first bought the shop, equipment manuals, a fireproof lockbox that was open and empty, and in the back corner, something that didn't fit with the rest, a wooden crate, the kind that looks intentional, not like random storage. Inside the crate was a folder. The folder had my name on it. Not my full name, just Tessa. Written in the same handwriting as the boxes, in blue ballpoint pen, like she'd written a note to leave in my lunch. I sat down on the bottom step and opened it. I don't think I can accurately describe what it felt like to read those pages with my mother already 3 weeks gone. It's like getting a letter that was written for a moment that has already passed. The paper carries the intention perfectly, but you're reading it from the other side of the thing it was trying to help you through. There were 3 documents in the folder. The first was a letter in her handwriting, 2 pages. She'd clearly written it over time. The pen changed partway through, and so did the slant of the letters, the way handwriting changes when you're tired or in pain. She told me that she bought the shop back because she couldn't stop thinking about it, that it had been the one thing in her life that was fully, completely hers, that she'd always intended to leave it to the person she thought could do something with it. She wrote that she knew I moved around because I was good at adapting, but that she'd always believed I was looking for something to stay for. She wrote that she hoped this was it. She didn't apologize for not telling me while she was alive. She said she'd been afraid I would argue with her. She was right. I would have. The second document was a property appraisal. The shop had been appraised 14 months before she died. The building, not the business, just the building and the land it sat on, was valued at significantly more than I would have guessed because the neighborhood had changed. It was in a part of the city that had been quietly gentrifying for the past several years. There were restaurants and coffee shops within 3 blocks now. The assessed value was 4 times what she paid to buy the building back. The third document was a business plan, 6 pages, typed. She'd had someone help her with it. Clearly, the formatting was cleaner than anything she would have done herself, but the ideas inside it were entirely hers. Notes on the market, notes on what the shop had done well before and what she'd do differently, notes on the specific equipment that would need to be replaced versus what could be refurbished, notes. And this made me sit there for a long moment on how my skill set would be an advantage. She'd written a paragraph about how the discipline of healthcare work translates directly to running a small business, patient documentation, complex scheduling, staying calm under pressure, communicating with people on difficult days. She had thought this through. She had planned it. She had done all of this while she was sick, while her hands were shaking, while I was sleeping on the cot down the hall. I sat on those stairs for a long time. My brother called me on a Saturday, about 6 weeks later. I was at the shop, which had become a pattern. I went every day, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for most of the afternoon. I'd hired a contractor to look at the structural things. I'd started calling equipment vendors. I'd applied for a small business loan at the local credit union, which I was still waiting to hear back on. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready for that conversation. He left a voicemail. He said he'd been thinking, and that he wanted to talk about what to do with the shop. He said he'd talked to someone. He didn't say who, and apparently the property had some value. He used those words, some value. He suggested maybe we should look into maximizing the asset. He suggested we get together to discuss options. I listened to the voicemail twice. Then I put my phone in my pocket and went back to cleaning out the utility room. I called him back 3 days later, which was long enough that I trusted myself to say what I actually meant without saying things I didn't. He answered on the first ring, which told me he'd been waiting. I told him I appreciated him reaching out. I told him I'd made my decision about the shop. I told him I was going to reopen it. Not exactly as what it had been, but something close. Dry cleaning, alterations, some additional services. I had a business plan. I'd been talking to a couple of former employees who'd indicated interest in coming back. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, carefully, Tessa, do you have any idea what that's going to take? Financially? You don't have the capital. You've been doing contract work for years. You don't have that kind of... I have the building, I said. The building needs work. I know what it needs. I've been assessing it for 6 weeks. Another silence. Then, Mom left you that place because she felt guilty. About not being there for you when you were younger. About, I don't know. She had a soft spot for the underdog. That's all this is. The underdog. After everything. I let that sit in the air between us for a moment. She left you the house, I said. She left me something she built with her own hands and loved for 21 years. I think she knew exactly what she was doing. He didn't have an answer for that. I told him I wasn't interested in selling. I told him I hoped his family was well. I told him I would be in touch when there was something to be in touch about. Then I hung up, sat down on the floor of the back room. The concrete was cold even through my jeans, and let myself feel it fully. The grief, the anger, the something else underneath both of those things that I'd been too careful to name yet. It was hope. I was pretty sure it was hope. The loan came through in April, smaller than I'd asked for, but enough to begin. I negotiated with the equipment vendor for a payment plan on the new solvent system. I found a local contractor who had done other commercial work in the neighborhood and agreed to phase the renovations, so I didn't have to have everything done before I could open. My old friend Danny, someone I'd kept in contact with from my first travel assignment years ago, a woman who'd left nursing to go back to school for business administration, agreed to consult with me on the financial side for equity instead of fees. It was the kind of favor that only makes sense between people who've known each other long enough to have lost count of the IOUs. I slept on an air mattress in my brother's old bedroom at Mom's house for the last week before the tenants moved in. He'd rented it out fast. I'll give him credit for that. I found a studio apartment 6 blocks from the shop, which was either convenient or I was manifesting something, depending on how you wanted to look at it. There was a woman named Patricia who had worked the counter at the shop for 11 years before Mom sold it. She was 63 now, retired, and according to her, she was losing her mind watching cable news all afternoon. She agreed to come back part-time when we reopened, which felt like the universe handing me something. The neighborhood, I noticed as the weeks went on, noticed us. The owner of the coffee shop down the street stopped in when he saw the renovation activity through the window. The woman who'd opened a plant shop 2 blocks over introduced herself when I was loading materials from my car. There was a sense, slowly, of being woven into something, of belonging to a particular block, a particular community of small business owners who nodded at each other on the sidewalk in a way that meant, I see you, I know what this costs, keep going. Mom had known. She'd seen the neighborhood changing, and she'd seen what it would become, and she bought the building back while she still could. I thought about that a lot, about how much she'd understood without ever saying it directly, about how the gift wasn't just the building, it was the instruction manual, the business plan, the letter, the evidence that she had watched me carefully enough to know what I was capable of, even when I didn't. We had a soft opening on a Wednesday in late June. I didn't make a big deal of it. A sign in the window, a post on the neighborhood social media page, a small discount for the first week. Patricia was there. Danny drove in from out of town and brought pastries, which we ate standing at the counter between customers. There weren't a lot of customers that first day. 6, 7, if you count the man who came in, looked around, and left without saying anything. But they came, and they came back the next day, and the day after that. My brother texted me a week after the opening. A single text, heard the shop opened. Hope it goes well. I sat with that text for a while. Thought about what Mom would have said. She was not a woman who believed in cutting people out. She believed in limits, in what you offered and what you withheld, in the difference between an open door and an unguarded one. I texted back, thank you. Come by sometime if you're in the area." I didn't expect him to. Maybe he would. People surprise you sometimes. They disappoint you and then they surprise you, and sometimes those things happen in the same person over a long enough timeline. What I knew, what I felt in my hands when I unlocked the front door in the morning, and what I felt in my chest when I stood at the counter and watched the neighborhood move past the window, was that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That my mother had seen it before I could. That the gift she gave me wasn't charity or guilt or a consolation prize. It was a map. She just needed me to be ready to read it. I keep thinking about the moment I moved that shelf. Not the folder, not what was inside it, just the moment right before, when I was standing in a dusty utility room that smelled like solvent and old paper, tired and homeless in the most technical sense of the word, and I almost didn't bother. I almost left the shelf where it was and drove to a motel and felt sorry for myself the way the situation seemed to invite. I didn't. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was habit, years of walking into unfamiliar hospitals, unfamiliar cities, and telling myself that the only way through a new place is to actually look at it. That instinct, the willingness to keep moving even when you're exhausted, even when you've just been told in so many words that you are the lesser version of yourself, that's not something that comes from circumstances. It comes from choosing over and over to stay in the game even when the game doesn't feel fair. My mother did it after my father died. She did it with a dry cleaning shop and 2 kids and a calendar full of double shifts. She didn't talk about it the way people talk about resilience now, like it's something you develop through the right podcast or the right morning routine. She just kept showing up. And somewhere in watching her do that for 20 years, it got into me. What I didn't understand until I read her letter is that she had been watching me too. That's the part that undoes me when I think about it too long. She saw something I couldn't see in myself. She tracked it quietly, turned it over in her mind while her hands were shaking, committed it to a typed business plan on pages I would find after she was gone. She didn't do that out of guilt. She did it out of clarity. She understood, in a way I hadn't caught up to yet, that the discipline I'd spent years applying to other people's recoveries, the patience, the systematic thinking, the ability to assess a situation without flinching, was the exact same set of skills a small business demands. That's a particular kind of intelligence, I think. Not the kind measured by tests. The kind that notices the whole person standing in front of you, accounts for what they're capable of rather than what they've demonstrated so far, and bets on the gap between the two. My brother had made his calculation about me years before that funeral. Somewhere along the way, he decided that moving around meant drifting, that service meant sacrifice without reward, that no mortgage and no fixed address added up to nothing. He looked at the same evidence my mother looked at and came to the opposite conclusion. I don't think he's a bad person for that. I think he stopped paying attention somewhere and never noticed. But my mother kept paying attention, even when it was hard to hold a pen. The thing about what she left me, and I mean the folder as much as the building, is that it asked something of me in return. It wasn't a gift you could receive passively. It required me to decide on a cold Tuesday night in February that I was going to be the person she saw when she wrote my name on that tab, that I was going to match her belief with actual work, that I was going to be worth what she'd done in secret on my behalf. That's the only kind of inheritance that means anything, not money, not property. Someone seeing clearly who you are and trusting you to grow into it. I think about that every morning when I unlock the front door. I think about what it costs to build something, not in dollars, but in the willingness to keep going on the days when nothing is working yet. I think about what my mother understood that most people are too busy or too comfortable to notice, that what a person does when no one's watching, when there's no reward in sight and the outcome isn't guaranteed, is the truest thing about them. She watched. She knew. Now I try to be worth knowing.